Hi, my name is Jan, and I'll be talking about using Emacs for technical writing. Now, let's first define what we mean by technical writing. Um, at least I mean with that any kind of writing that involves computer systems. So maybe a developer guide for a system or a library that you've been creating, maybe reference documentation or a user guide for a REST API that you offer as a cloud service, or doing a technical presentation exactly like this one that may actually include some live coding as well that you may want to do while you're showing the presentation without too much context switching. I've been doing a variety of these things in my professional life for a while now, and I found Emacs to be a really nice tool to help out with that, since it actually pulls in different languages, like the ones I work with is Scala, Java, C++, things like that, and everything works in the same way within Emacs, so you don't have to learn different tools to do the same thing. Doing all of this against Java looks the same as it would with C++, except the language is different. A little refresher for people that might be viewing this out of context. Emacs is a very customizable text editor environment, and org mode is a part of Emacs that allows you to deal with structured text. So a plain text file containing headings, lists, tables, and even code blocks formatted in a particular way, so org mode can help out with that. And org babel is the particular part of org mode that deals with executing those code blocks and actually interacting with, say, a Java or a Python environment underneath and showing the results of that right inside the same org file. So let's look at what a couple of scenarios using this might actually look like. And let's start with imagining that we are writing a developer guide for a service or a library that we or a computer program that we might be writing, and imagine that we have some dependencies that the program requires that are configured using Docker Compose. For those that don't know Docker Compose, it's a way to quickly describe some Linux programs that can be immediately run without installing too much dependencies. You define these using a YAML file called a Docker Compose file. Now here inside Emacs, we have a block that defines a YAML file, and we actually saying this is called docker.compose, docker-compose.yaml, with some content here. And you can see that even though we are in org mode knows that it can highlight this according to YAML. And org mode doesn't directly know about YAML. We just said, hey, this block has to do with YAML. And because there's a YAML mode in Emacs, it will borrow from that mode to actually highlight this block. Now, the fun thing is that there's a feature in org called tangling that allows you to take these kinds of blocks and actually export them to separate files. So if we look at the directory that we're in right now, we see that we just got the presentation. There's no Docker Compose file yet. If I say Ctrl+C, Ctrl+V+T, and I go back and refresh this directory, now we have a Docker Compose file as well, which has the content in that we just created here. And that's very nice because conceptually, we don't actually need to leave org mode. We can say something about this file and have the contents of the file in the same descriptive document, while also having some actual side effect of the file existing on disk and us being able to interact with it. For example, we could, now that the file is there, invoke Docker Compose and actually create the Nginx web server that we're defining here. So let's do that. We have a little block here that runs a shell script. If I invoke that from org mode, we get the results here. We see that now we have a web server running on port 8080. That's, by the way, serving up the contents of the directory that we're in here on port 8080. So that's already quite nice. Let's look at another scenario where we may be documenting a REST API. REST APIs use a lot of HTTP interactions, typically describing an XML or a JSON structure and which HTTP verb get or put to use with that and a URL. And there's actually a nice extension to org babel called REST Client that you can install that allows you to describe these kind of requests right inside Emacs. First, let's make sure that our HTTP server has something to respond with that's a little interesting, for example, an XML file. We already know how to do that, so let's create a code block type XML that we can tangle to a file called test.xml, Ctrl+C, Ctrl+V+T. And now, if we look at the directory again, we have a test.xml file. And now we can have a new type of block called REST client, which will invoke REST client, and anything you type into here will be sent as an HTTP request to the server that you specify. So now, right now, it goes to localhost on 8080, and let's see if we can get our test.xml file back. I've just invoked this, and you can see we get this back, and the content type of the server, if we scroll down a little bit, I think we see the headers here. Yeah, so the server said it's text/XML, and REST client is smart enough to actually invoke Emacs's SGML mode to highlight it. I'm not exactly sure what the difference is between SXML and XML mode, and there's an XML mode. They all pretty much know how to deal with XML. In this case, SGML was chosen, which is fine. But you can see we just served up that test XML file, and we can have some actual text here describing, hey, if you do this request, you might get a response like that, and the server will actually serve that up and insert it right into the org mode document. By the way, we're looking at this now inside Emacs, rendered somewhat interestingly, but obviously you can export this to a PDF or HTML or in all sorts of nice and different ways as well, depending what your particular needs are. Of course, we can't just send GET requests, we can send PUT requests as well, and just like in plain HTTP, you have the PUT method on the first line, then your headers, then a blank line, and then the body. If we try and invoke this, then Nginx will say 4 or 5 not allowed, because obviously just running a plain web server will not allow you to actually upload any files. But this, of course, could have been any other response as well. Yeah. Now let's look at doing presentations themselves, like the one you're looking at. There's a package that I like to use a lot, which is called org-tree-slide. That's the one that's active right now, which takes an org document and allows you to show one heading at a time. So it doesn't matter whether it's the first level, second level, third level heading. They sort of fold into nice things at the top, where you can sort of go through a document one piece at a time. And I actually do like to use org Babel at the same time to do some live coding in that as well. And there are actually 2 ways to go to a PDF. You can just use the normal org export option to go to a PDF, which is Ctrl-C, Ctrl-E, and then LP. But if you use REST client, the LaTeX file underneath sometimes gets a little wonky, because those things don't directly work together. I wrote a little bit of Lisp to help out with that, which you can look at if you check out my presentation later. There's another package for org Babel called Beamer, or OX-Beamer it's called, which uses a LaTeX style called Beamer to create a PDF. And that one looks... that one tries to actually create 1 page per slide. You would actually have a PDF with the slides. But that one is a lot more picky on what your org file is structured like. So you need to have all your leaf headings at the same level, which I typically don't do. So I can show you what this one looks like from this presentation. So you get a nice title slide, and then it tries to make an outline, which is the one level above. And the slides sort of look okay, but as you go further, they sort of start to run into, things not flowing as they should. I'm sure with a lot more LaTeX knowledge, you could make this look a lot nicer. But personally, I tend to just create a normal PDF document that's just text with all the actual content of the document inside the text. You can see the highlighting of especially REST client stuff. That works just fine, and it's enough for my needs. So I just tend to make plain PDFs. Since we only have 10 minutes, I will not go into the detailed configuration. You can check out the presentation online to see how all these packages are configured and how I use them. But for now, that's all I have. I do recommend you try this out yourself if you have any kind of documentation or textual things to do. Just pick one of these packages at a time, integrate them into your configuration. If you haven't already, that's really the best way to go about this. And Google is your friend. If you think, hey, how would I do this with these packages? Definitely do that. More things I will be looking at is using this concept to write unit or integration tests. You can imagine if you have a documentation in org mode that describes your service as a function of its REST API, you may want to actually run all those commands as part of your build and check if all the documentation is still in order. I'm not doing that yet, but I'm definitely looking into that. And I'm also writing some extensions to use Java and Scala in a somewhat higher level with org mode, but that's not entirely working yet, and we don't have time to go into that today. So, but that's it. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I'll be able for questions later.